In this section, we're going to be talking about Active Directory directory service and the components that make it up. There's both logical and physical components that make up an Active Directory network, which is essentially the core components of really any Microsoft network. So some of those core components are the ones that you see listed here. We have logical components like partitions. There's about 3 partitions that are predominantly used. When we talk about partitions, we have a configuration partition, which will house things like subnet and site information. We'll have another partition called the schema partition, which will house information about the schema itself. We will also have a partition called the domain partition, which will have information about users, groups, computers, and all the objects that we would have within a domain. So those 3 partitions make up the partition as a whole. And there's actually a 4th partition, which is called the application partition, and it's used really when we talk about Active Directory Integrated and DNS. So it's an optional partition, but those 3 core are really the ones we want to focus on. And we'll find out a little bit more in later episodes. We also have the schema. This is considered a logical component, and the schema is essentially a master list of every object and its attribute that we can use with an Active Directory. So things like users, groups, computers, all the different components that you would find in Active Directory are in the schema, and then their attributes are also listed. So we have the ability to alter that schema for the schema master. We also have the ability to change the schema for applications like Exchange and other applications that might need a schema extension. We also have another logical component called a domain. And when we talk about a domain, we're really talking about an administrative unit. So if I have a network that I want to manage, that could be part of a domain. More on that in a bit. We also are going to take a look at domain trees, another logical component. The domain tree is essentially a contiguous namespace within Active Directory, such as a parent and a child. So you might have a parent domain called something like contoso.com, and then you could have a child domain off of that, maybe that's called atlanta.contoso.com. So when we have a domain tree, we have a contiguous namespace, contoso.com, atlanta.contoso.com, and so on. And when we talk about a domain tree, we're talking usually about a parent-child relationship. And again, a little bit more on that in further episodes. We have a forest too. This is also considered a logical component. The forest itself could be comprised of one domain or many domains. And when we talk about a forest, we're talking about having the ability to have multiple domains if we'd like, all of which can share information, share resources. We'll have the domains with two-way transitive trust relationships between them. You can also have more than one forest if you'd like. We're going to talk more about forests in our next section. We also have sites. A site is a logical component, and it's usually related to a physical location. So I might have a campus that has maybe 3 buildings. Each of those buildings could have their own site, and then those sites can talk to one another. So the site would be set up usually by default, but you can go in and you can make changes to it if you'd like. And if you decide to do that, it's usually because between the 2 buildings you might have a connection that's a little slower and a connection that's not as reliable. So we'll get into sites a little bit later in some of the later episodes too. We also have OUs, or organizational units. This is the way we are going to manage our network. The OUs are really seen just by the administrator. So we're going to be using these maybe organized by location. We might want to organize them by maybe region. We might want to organize them maybe by function. But the OUs are going to help us when it comes also to dispensing group policy objects. So we might want to organize these based on how we want group policy deployed. So we'll again talk about OUs coming up. Containers is another logical component, and the container can really be, an OU can be classified as a container. The container, there's a number of them that are built in. We'll see some of those going forward here, but we have built-in ones, we have ones that we can create. The container is a little bit different than an OU, although an OU is considered a container, but the container itself cannot have a group policy object attached to it. So that's kind of the defining line, and the icon looks a little bit different when we look at Active Directory users and computers, which is one of the tools that we're going to be working with when we work with Active Directory. When it comes to physical components, we have domain controllers. And when we talk about domain controllers, we're talking about normally having 2 domain controllers per domain. And the reason for that is in the event one of them were to die, the second one would still be available to answer incoming client requests, because the domain controller is responsible for authenticating clients to give them access or deny them access into the domain. The domain controller is also responsible for passing along authorization and saying what you're allowed to access once you get into the domain. So those are going to be very crucial, and we're going to actually set one up in a little bit of a later episode. We also have data stores. Believe it or not, Active Directory is a database. It's a JET database, so it runs off of a very similar database as what you'd have as Access would be using. When we talk about the data store, we're talking about a file called ntds.dit, and we're going to talk about how to back that database up. We'll talk about how to clone it, how to copy it, a lot of fun stuff coming up. We also have a global catalog server as one of our physical components. The global catalog server is a domain controller, but it's a special domain controller. It's a domain controller that can help us when we have multiple domains in our forest and a user is trying to log in and trying to find the domain controller that can help them. It could also be used for finding people, printers. It's really when we have a multi-domain scenario that we're going to find global catalog servers helpful. And there are applications that will require the global catalog server to be functional. So again, we'll spend some more time with the global catalog server also coming up. And then one of our last physical components that we're going to talk about here is our RODC, or the Read-Only Domain Controller. And when we talk about the Read-Only Domain Controller, it is a special type of domain controller. It's a domain controller, just like the name sounds, that's read-only. So that domain controller doesn't do any replication with other domain controllers that are on our network. And we're going to use it usually in a scenario where we have maybe a branch office, where we don't have maybe an admin out at that branch office. Maybe also it's a branch office that we don't have a secure data center that we can use or a secure room to lock up our domain controller. So it's for scenarios when we'd like to log people into a local branch office, but at the same time we do not want them to, the domain controller to get compromised in any way because it's not a secure scenario. Now let's dive a little bit deeper and start talking about some of the terms that are going to be crucial to understanding Active Directory. One of those is the forest. And when we talk about a forest, we're talking about the top-level container in an Active Directory network. So if I want to install Active Directory, I will have to install a forest. And as you can see from this slide, we have a forest root. The forest root is the very first domain that you will create for Active Directory when you would like to set up an Active Directory network. Notice that the forest root has a name. It's called adatum.com in this scenario. Notice that it has a child domain, the abbreviation there for Atlanta, and you can see the contiguous namespace between adatum and atlanta.adatum.com. So this would be considered a tree. And as you take a look too, you can look off to the left and you can see that we have Fabricam. And with Fabricam, what you can see over there is we can have a discontiguous namespace if we'd like to create another tree. So not all the domains in a forest have to have the same name. You can go with different names. And most of the time what you will find is you will find that every forest in a lot of cases will simply have one domain. So maybe we're a larger company, we have a larger scenario, and if that's the case, we're going to probably have maybe a domain per location. They kind of have to fill this out. There's a lot of planning when you create a forest. And so if we have a scenario like we have here, maybe we've merged with another company, we have Adatum and we merged with Fabricam. If that's the case, then chances are we will have another tree that will have another namespace. So when you create a forest, a lot of planning goes into this. And as you can see, you start off with the forest root and then we build everything from there. Now the forest root is going to have a user called the enterprise admin. The enterprise admin has the ability to administer the entire forest. We will also have another user only available in the forest root like the enterprise admin, and that is the schema admin. And the schema admin has the ability to adjust either add, make changes to the schema. And if you remember, the schema was our central place where we go to either add additional objects or add additional attributes or change objects and attributes in the Active Directory database. So those two users, Enterprise Admin and Schema Admin, will be in our forest root. And then you can add as many domains as you like, and you can decide what you want to call them. And we will spend some time a little bit later discussing that planning process. Another component that is very critical to running Active Directory is the Active Directory domain. When we talk about a domain, we're actually talking about an administrative unit. And a lot of companies simply go with one domain. But a lot of times one size doesn't normally fit all. It really depends on how your company is spread out, location-wise. It also depends on whether or not you would like each location to be managed by one central location, or you want to spread it out. So when we talk about a domain, we're talking about an administrative unit, and it's comprised of users, groups, and computers, as you can see from our graphic. So all the users that you'd like to have be part of your domain, people who'd like to log into your domain and be able to use resources in your domain will be housed here. Also groups, when you want to put your users together in groups so that you can manage them more efficiently and easily. And you will also have computer accounts, computers that have been joined to your domain, and you're going to manage it all from one central location. We'll see some of those management tools coming up. When we talk about a domain too, we're also talking about a replication boundary, in that we have replication occur within a domain. So if I have a domain that is essentially one location, I can have replication between domain controllers within that domain. And what is replicated are changes, additions, and deletions to your domain objects, users, groups, computers predominantly. We also will see that the domain can be managed by the Administrative Center. There's an Active Directory Administrative Center that we're going to be taking a closer look at, and it's the newer tool that could be used to manage your domain. But another tool that we've used for quite a long time is our Active Directory users and computers. So we'll be taking a look at both, because in a lot of cases, maybe you want to use one versus the other. And there are certain tools that will be available in one and not in the other. So we'll take a look at that coming up. Another thing that we get with the domain is the domain provides not only authentication to say whether or not a user can enter the domain and use resources, but it also provides authorization. And that gives us the ability to say what you're allowed to access. So authentication is whether you can come into the domain or not. Authorization is what can I access once I'm in the domain. And if I'm allowed to access something, let's say a resource like a SQL Server, what am I allowed to do with that resource? Can I read it? Can I edit it? Can I make changes to it? All of that would be done through authorization. And then we also have the ability here with the domain to create, of course, it's comprised of domain controllers. So how many domain controllers do I want to have to create my domain? You really technically only need one domain controller, but in the event that that domain controller were to go down, it's a good practice to have at least 2 domain controllers per domain. And if I have 2 domain controllers, they can both answer client requests to get authenticated to use resources in the domain, and they can both authorize clients to get connected to the domain to use resources. And then they're going to replicate from one to another the information that they have. So as users, groups, and computers change, that information is replicated from one domain controller to another. And those domain controllers are essentially read-write domain controllers. So I can go to any domain controller and make a change to Active Directory, and then it's going to replicate its changes out. More on that coming up. Phew, so many things to talk about with Active Directory. And we've just scratched the surface, believe it or not. We have so many more things to talk about. We've just finished a little section about the logical and physical components of Active Directory. We've hit a topic about the forest, and we've also talked about what a domain is. For this next section, we're going to be talking about OUs, global catalog servers, and we're also going to focus in on domain controllers.